I think that the most important thing I want these students to walk away with is confidence. And I want to backtrack to my own story as a way to think about the kind of confidence I'm looking for them to have. As a high school student, I did traditional debate, and traditional debate had very little discussion of things like systemic impact. So we didn't talk about racism or sexism or really classism. Any of those issues were sort of, pushed to the wayside in the kind of competition I competed in. And the result of that is that I had a great deal of difficulty, despite having all of that civil rights background and knowing a great deal about Black history and being raised by civil rights activists, I actually had very little vocabulary to talk about racism itself. Unless you were saying something that was overtly racist, that was on the par of Jim Crow racism, right? It was very difficult for me to articulate what structural racism looked like and what that meant for actual Black bodies living in the United States. And it wasn't until I got to college that I had the first opportunity to even debate racism as an issue. And it was one of the environment topics, I can't remember what year it was, and my affirmative that year was environmental racism. One of the first times that environmental racism had been raised as an issue in competitive debate practice, although we've had years of environmental topics. And I remember having debates where people at that point were still willing to say things like racism good, and losing those debates because I was unable to articulate why they were wrong about those claims. And it wasn't until after I got out of debate in a lot of ways that I started to really have the vocabulary for talking about things like white supremacy or heteropatriarchy or imperialism in a way that was cogent and direct and responsive to the arguments that other people were making. So for these students today who are reading Huey's autobiography and Asada's and learning about the Combahee River Collective and the Black Panther Party and the Civil Rights Movement, and not just the Civil Rights Movement, right, with Dr. King, they're learning about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they are learning about Ella Baker, they're learning about Bayard Rustin, those who are not normally really thoughtfully engaged in the history that we tell our kids or our students in our high school classes. Then they are learning a way to talk about not just the history of racism, but contemporary racial practices that operate against them. These students can talk about racial profiling. They can talk about the ways in which racism operates against African Americans in the court system. They can talk about the ways in which politics ignores the issues of Black people. And they can talk about the ways in which Obama doesn't necessarily represent the interests of Black people, because they are not going to be willing to be snowed by the lip service that politicians pay to race issues without dealing directly with structural racism. They at 16, 17, and 18 are able to talk about race in a way that I did not learn to talk about until I was almost a doctoral student. We are training them younger, right, to be able to be responsive to their environments. So now when we talk about police brutality, they don't just have to be like, I hate the cops, right? They can say, here's how police brutality functions in our city. These are the regulations that the police follow. Here's how our judges interact with people who have to face police brutality. This is how the system functions. They can do that rather than just saying, screw the police. That, I think, is the most important thing that I want them to walk away with here, which is the confidence to talk about structural oppression. And that's something that I think that we don't see as consistently amongst our youth. And as a result, they get confused about where they are in the world, who they are, what they have access to, or what they can even do about it. They don't see themselves as agents of change. It's because all they see is the consequences of the system, but not how the system operates. We got to learn how the system operates.